Not knowing what you're really going to do at your developer job is more common than you think. If you're anything like me, you started studying coding and learning all this fun stuff, hoping to get a job someday. But when that day arrives, everything feels different to what you learn at uni or your development course. You see, getting a developer job as a front-end developer is just the first step. Imagine you are there and you just started working at some company. Congrats, but now what? What is your job going to look like day to day? Knowing what comes next will not only give you a more educated understanding of what is being a front-end developer. And yeah, trust me, it is much more than just CSS and building buttons. This is the guy I wish I had many years ago. This is the guide to what you should actually do in your day-to-day job to become a successful front-end developer. Hey friends, I'm Steven. I've been working as a software engineer in the EU and the UK now for more than 5 years. I happen to have been in your position in the past, and that's why I'm here to help you land your first developer job. Let's start with the fun bit, code. Yeah. It is no secret you'll have to code. You'll have to code a lot. There are 3 main types of coding you'll do in your day-to-day. These types form what I've called the front-end pyramid. These are user interfaces, front-end ops, and QA or quality assurance. In my opinion, these will be 3 integral points that you should take part in on all of your front-end coding. Think of front-end ops and QA as your foundation layer, so all your UI is maintained consistently and healthy. In other words, your UI works properly and it doesn't break. But let's define what each of these really is, starting with user interfaces. So, while working in UIs, you'll have to translate designs into code, work on data modeling and maintenance, just to name a few. Translating designs into code is one of the most common tasks front-end developers do. Here, if you're lucky and the company you work for have a design team allocated, then you'll be given a design that you'll have to recreate in code. If not, in some companies, the same front-end developer is expected to do some low-fidelity designs so you can code them. Anyway, you'll code these designs using HTML, CSS, JavaScript, or any other library and framework like React, Sass, Tailwind, etc. Just to give you an example, with this you'll be creating layouts and entire interface with custom UI components like buttons, links, models, inputs, and many others. In some cases, depending on the company as well, this will be pre-built shareable components, a dedicated design systems team created. So you'll import these components into your code to build your app. By the way, the design system team is the team whose main purpose is to create shareable UI components so that every app the company decides to create follows the same principles and branding. Normally, medium to big size companies have a design system in place. You may be already familiar with them without having noticed it. For example, Google has a design system named Material UI, and that's what they use in their apps, and that's why they all look similar or have sort of the same style. Later on, as you create these user interfaces, you'll have to connect them one with another, so there's a seamless flow and the user of your web app can navigate through them. For this, you'll have to work on the routing that makes possible this workflow. Data modeling is the part where you work with API integration. So it is basically all of the information you will need to bring back from the backend to populate the front end with data. For example, when you go to your profile section on Instagram, all the information you see there, like your number of followers, your bio, and your profile picture, is stored somewhere in a server. Well, the front end calls this data from the backend or server and then displays it to you in a very meaningful or stylish way. Lastly, for this section, we have maintenance. Here you'll be working on tech debt, also known as refactoring, and this will mean improving your code so it is better organized, documented, or even more performant. Also, many other times you'll be working on bug fixes. Now, let's talk about ops. Front-end ops could be many things, but basically the kind of work it refers to is the work you'll do setting up your application's infrastructure, creating scripts, or even managing deployments. Now, what are usually these scripts? Sometimes you'll need to create scripts that will help you to be productive when working on your apps. For example, a few simple ones are if you have a command to start up the server of your app locally, or even run some specific unit tests. Other more complicated ones would be creating code mods, which are scripts that will allow you to make changes in your code automatically, without you needing to search for every instance manually and change it in the code. Then we have infrastructure. More than just coding a piece of UI, you'll need to set the foundation so your application works correctly, or so you have a local server to run your app. For this, use a build tool like Webpack. These tools will require a certain setup, so they, for example, transform your code into different JavaScript versions, or minify your code so your app is more performant, and blah blah blah. There's a lot to it, honestly. Lastly, you'll be working with CI/CD tools like CircleCI or Jenkins, which you'll need to use to build your apps and then deploy them to production or your different environments. So in simple terms, every time you change something in your app, a new version is created. This version goes through different checks in the CI/CD tool, like it will run your unit tests, check that everything is okay and that your changes in your code didn't break the application. So finally you can deploy your shiny new version to your site and show off that sexy new button with everybody in the world. Although there are QA or quality assurance engineers, front-end engineers will act as the first line of fire when working on their apps, meaning that you'll have to test all of the changes you make to your app. You do this by creating unit tests in your app, deploying your changes to testing environments, and manually testing your changes before they go to production. And lastly, creating end-to-end tests like automated tests. Just so you know, there are these libraries that test your apps as if the user were browsing your site. This last step will vary depending on if it is required to do it yourself in your team. By the way, remember to like this video and subscribe to the channel, as apparently the YouTube algorithm likes this. Working in teams is a big part of being a software developer in general. Usually you'll be iterating over these duties: pair programming, front-end guilds, or front-end related regular meetings. You'll also have to deal with stakeholders and work on tech demos. Especially when you're a junior developer, pair programming will be super helpful to understand the workflow of a certain app. You and your colleague can propose different ideas on how to solve a certain problem in code. In fact, it is a good idea to get used to this because part of some interview processes require you to pair program with your interviewer. Moving on now to front-end guilds. Normally, you'll have to discuss different pieces of work with many of your front-end colleagues. Perhaps take architectural decisions all together, create standard or conventions where you would apply this to your different front-end apps, or even talked about the new shiny button that was just added to your design system library. A good example for this collaboration would be, imagine if you have an application A and you create this function that calculates how many Jedis turn to the dark side. Then a colleague working in application B needs to calculate this as well. If this is the case, the function shouldn't be created over again, right? You would probably let your colleague know that this function already exists, so there's no duplication of code. For this and for many other reasons, it is always a good idea to maintain regular communication with your front-end folks. So as part of what I just mentioned, any successful team needs to be in constant communication. And this is also true for the other parts of the business. You need to clarify with the backend team what is going to be the contract or agreed shape of the data a certain endpoint will return, so you can start working on a feature or piece of work. You need to talk frequently to the design team to clarify the design of UIs handed off to you. QA engineers will reach out to complain about the bug you just introduced to the application, so you need to deal with them as well. Also, depending on how your team is formed, there will be a project manager or business analyst helping with project creations and translating business requirements into technical ones. Last but not least, in many cases you need to talk to the user of your application or the product owner. From here you could gather new requirements for future pieces of work, for example. In my experience, in some companies I've worked for, there's some sort of tech demo or presentation happening at the end of every sprint. So every 2 or 3 weeks, here is where you present all the stuff you have worked on in all that time. PRs or pull requests reviews will be also your day-to-day. Basically, you'll be reviewing code changes your colleagues have worked on, as well as they will be reviewing yours. This of course with the purpose of integrating those changes into code bases. Think of a new functionality added to Spotify where you can message your favorite artist, for example. Man, you don't always realize, but as I'm filming this video, I see how many hats we really have to wear at work. So yeah, project management. You'll be doing a lot of this as well, like creating and reviewing tickets and documenting all your projects. As if this wasn't enough, as a developer you'll also need to take the initiative and collaborate with your team, creating tickets in your Jira or Trello board, or whatever you're using when needed. Normally in these tickets you'll specify all the scenarios needed to, for example, add a new feature to an app. There are different types of tickets, like stories, tasks, bugs, and spikes. Each of them has its own purpose. I won't explain it here, maybe in a future video, but you can just Google it in the meantime. So reviewing tickets will be part of your work as well. So make sure you understand the requirements for that new feature your business wants you to develop. Ask as many questions as you need before you start working on them, and happy coding. Just in general, avoid losing time in requirements that you don't really understand. Whether this is Confluence, which is Jira's documentation site, or in the wiki of your project on GitHub, documenting your projects apart from just commenting on your code is super helpful and 100% recommended if you want just to remember why your project is using X library instead of Z library, or what is the purpose of your application, for example. You and your team will thank you in the future for sure. So what do you think, folks? I think there's a lot more to front-end development than just playing with CSS. To be honest, most of the time I don't even get to touch CSS for quite a while, as some projects need minimum styling changes. This guide is something for sure I would have wished to have before starting working as a developer. It has so much insight into what you really do in your day-to-day job. There's much more stuff I haven't covered here, but for sure these are the most common duties a front-end developer should work on to be successful in the role. If you're thinking of pursuing a career in front-end development or are still a bit unsure, check out this video where I talked about the future of the front-end job market. It will give you an idea of the job opportunities you'll have. Well, hopefully see you in the next one. Ciao, ciao.